Thank you, and again, my apologies. I would like to thank you all for coming tonight, and also remind you that this is the first in a series of talks, and our next talk is October 24th, with Disha Ray. Will be talking on Gandhi, a paper called Great Soldier, Great Schemer, exploring the myth of Mahatma Gandhi. Well, Robert Gosden is a good character to talk about and evil in history. That's not my stomach, it's the microphone, I think. Because depending on your perspective, he traveled the spectrum from good and evil, moving from anarchist militant to police informant. And I leave it to you to decide which of those is good and which is evil. And yet at his funeral service in April 1961, much of his story was unknown to the few people who gathered there. Much of what they knew was what you would have known about very many white British male immigrants to Canada before World War I. He was born in Surrey in England in 1882, the last of 9 children. His father was a farm laborer. The census doesn't tell us what his mother did. He had 2 older sisters who worked as domestic servants. Bob, as I've come to know him, lo, these 30 years now, immigrated to Canada in 1907 and worked most of his life as a laborer. At the end of his life, he was a gardener and a landscaper. He was a good stepfather to 2 sons, had a little cabin on the Sunshine Coast, a little retreat. He married Helena Hessen late in life and told rollicking stories about life as a migrant worker in the early days in British Columbia. So that there was much, however, that the mourners did not know about Bob. By 1911, he had made his way to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, working as a navvy, a road construction worker. You see a picture of that here, doing that pick and shovel work. And it's here that his life becomes less typical. In Prince Rupert, a young Bob Gosden took part in a strike against the private contractors that the city had hired to build roads. The navvies joined a union called the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, a revolutionary industrial union that was formed in Chicago in 1905 to organize the mass of workers that craft unions tended to ignore and exclude. These were often so-called unskilled workers, women, workers of all races and ethnicities, largely excluded from the craft union movement. The working class and the employing class have nothing in common, begins the IWW's constitution. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, we must inscribe on our banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wage system. The crowd goes wild. I've had bosses that wanted to do that. That's not what the Wobblies meant. The IWW was both a revolutionary organization and a union. And it led some of the most important and dramatic strikes in North America in the years before World War I, including a strike of railway workers in the Fraser Canyon. We see here arrested Wobblies in Kamloops in 1912. Gosden joined the IWW in Prince Rupert. He wrote to the union's newspaper, The Industrial Worker, observing that this jerkwater city is composed of tar paper shacks filled with wage slaves, and the owners of this rockin' muskeg are waiting to boom it up and to get suckers to come here and buy it up. Some things never change. No offense to people from Prince Rupert. That's a general comment on boosterism and someone who just spent an hour in traffic to get across a bridge because of all the construction. I'm not a bitter man, I promise. When strikers and scabs and police fought during that strike, several union members, including Bob Gosden, were arrested. Bob spent 3 months in jail for counseling assault. Hero, villain, that's up to you. Once released from jail, Gosden lit out for California. In later life, he claimed that he had joined other Wobblies to take part in the Mexican Revolution, and he may well have. We do know that he took part in an IWW free speech fight in San Diego. The IWW did much of its organizing on street corners. They would just get on a soapbox and start to organize and try to bring people in to join the union. And often city officials would ban street speaking to shut down the organizing drive, as Vancouver did in 1912. The IWW would then respond by calling on members from across the continent to come to that city with the purpose of getting up, making a public speech, and getting arrested. The idea was that then the city would have to pay to house them and to feed them, and since many of them were migrant transient workers anyway, this was not a bad deal, and that resulting economic pressure and publicity would push the government to rescind its ban on public speaking, as was the case in Vancouver. In San Diego, however, the strategy went terribly wrong. The Wobblies there were met with vigilantes and police who attacked them, tarred and feathered them. We joke about tarring and feathering, but it was actually a very horrible thing with very hot tar applied to the skin and feathers, which are almost impossible to remove without removing your skin. Many of them were beaten, burned with matches and cigars. Several were forced to run gauntlets where they were beaten with whips and clubs. Robert Gosden, we see here a picture of the San Diego free speech fight, getting fire hoses turned on people. Gosden was arrested at that free speech fight in February 1912, held in jail without trial for 9 months. He used that time to reflect on his recent experiences and concluded that revolution was necessary. And he now urged every IWW member to engage in industrial sabotage at every conceivable opportunity. Gosden was actually not unique in this. The IWW debated for years the use of sabotage in its newspapers, and Gosden was only one of many advocates. Now, by sabotage, the IWW meant, well, some such as Elizabeth Gurley Flynn here meant the conscious withdrawal of efficiency, the slowdown, the work to rule. Others, including Bob Gosden, meant everything up to and including the destruction of machinery to hurt the boss's profit and so force him to pay better wages. The IWW even developed its own iconography around sabotage. You see the wooden shoe here, the sabot. The legend is that French workers threw the wooden shoes into the machinery to jam it up, to sabotage the machinery. I'm not an entomologist. I'm not sure if that's correct or not. And they had another symbol, the sabotabby, the cat of sabotage. So popular was this that there was even a song written about sabotage. Let's see if I can tune up here. My road crew still hasn't made it. It was set to a very popular song called Tarara Boom Da, sort of a music that someone's got it. Yes, that's right. A music hall number, complete with high kicks that I'm not going to. Well, I'll do one little sort of kick here. And, I don't know. I learned that from Judy Fraser, our manager, who was a dancer before she went with us. So it took her 4 years to teach me to do that. Okay. Whoa, sorry. No promise I can hit that note now that I've found it. Can you see that all right? Can you sing along? I had a job once threshing wheat, worked 16 hours with hands and feet. When the moon was shining bright, they kept me working all the night. One moonlight night, I hate to tell, I accidentally slipped and fell. A pitchfork went right in between some cogwheels of that thresh machine. Ta-ra-ra-boom-de-ay, it made a noise that way, and wheels and bolts and hay went flying every way. That stingy Rube said, well, 1,000 shot to hell, but I did sleep that night, I needed it all right. Next day, that stingy Rube did say, I'll bring my eggs to town today. You grease my wagon up, you mutt, and don't forget to screw the nut. I greased his wagon up all right, I plumb forgot to screw the nut. And when he started on that trip, the wheel slipped off and broke his hip. Ta-ra-ra-boom-de-ay, it made a noise that way. That Rube was sure a sight, and mad enough to fight. His whiskers and his legs were full of scrambled eggs. I told him, that's too bad, I'm feeling very sad. And then that farmer said, you jerk, I bet you are and I won't work. He paid me off right there by gum, so I went home and told my chum. Next day when threshing did commence, my chum was Johnny on the fence. Upon my word, that awkward kid dropped his pitchfork like I did. Ta-ra-ra-boom-de-ay, it made a noise that way, and part of that machine, it Reuben on the bean. He cried, oh me, oh my, I nearly lost my eye. My partner said, you're right, it's bedtime now, good night. But still that Rube was plenty wise. These things did open up his eyes. He said, there must be something wrong. I think I work my men too long. He cut the hours and raised the pay, gave ham and eggs for every day, gets his men from the Union Hall, has no accidents at all. Ta-ra-ra-boom-de-ay, that Rube is feeling gay. He learned his lesson quick, just through a simple trick. Fixing rotten jobs and fixing greedy slobs. This is the only way. Ta-ra-ra-boom-de-ay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Bob continued to advocate sabotage after he left prison during the Vancouver Island strike that raged there from 1912 through 1914. The strike began when miners at Canadian collieries declared a one-day holiday to protest the company's discrimination against two members of the Workers' Safety Committee. That was followed by a lockout and a strike organized by the United Mine Workers of America, who poured over $1 million into the strike. Miners were thrown out of the company houses. The militia was sent in, as you can see here. Mines were dynamited, charivaris and marches were held, and over 200 miners were arrested and sentenced to 1 and 2 year prison terms for unlawful assembly. One imprisoned worker, Joseph Meyers, a popular young sports hero, died in Ocala prison while serving his prison term when his case of peritonitis from a ruptured intestine went ignored by prison authorities. In November 1913, workers and leftists formed the Miners' Liberation League to pressure the government to release the imprisoned miners. At one of the mass meetings of the Liberation League, Gosden insisted, by the end of this month, every last peaceful appeal which is necessary or possible for us to make as citizens of this Dominion for the release of our brothers in prison will have been made. By the end of the year, all peaceful measures will have been exhausted. If they are not released by the time of the new year, if Premier Sir Richard McBride, Attorney General Bowser, or any of their minions and politicians go hunting, they will be very foolish, for they will be shot dead. These men would also be well advised to employ some sucker to taste their coffee in the morning before drinking it, if they value their lives. And in addition, it will cost them $1 million a week for every week that our brothers remain in jail. Of course, the mainstream press and respectable labor leaders denounced Gosden for this speech, which is a little outrageous. Hero, villain. Robert Foster, the president of United Mine Workers District 28, and thus the local officer in charge of the strike, immediately attacked Gosden and insisted that Gosden's extremely foolish utterances in no way expresses any of the views or aims of the United Mine Workers Union. Fair enough. Yet despite, or perhaps because of his inflammatory language, Gosden was then elected president of the Miners' Liberation League. When he stepped down a week or so later, before he could be forced out in the aftermath of this speech, he was then elected vice president and elected to the press committee of the League. And this re-election tells us, I think, something important. It suggests that while respectable and responsible elements in the labor movement could not distance themselves fast enough and far enough from Gosden, his militancy, in fact, was supported by many others. Clearly, repudiation of more radical tactics was not complete or universal during this strike. There is, of course, a world of difference between cheering a fiery speech and acting on a suggestion that you assassinate the premier. My point is only that Gosden had clearly had a sense of the anger and the impatience of many involved in the strike and the Miners' Liberation League. Gosden's call for violence and sabotage also needs to be read a little more carefully. There was rather less, or perhaps rather more, to it than it seemed. It was clearly a rhetorical device to play to the crowd rather than a serious call for assassination, and it clearly worked, given his re-election and the thunderous applause with which he was greeted. I also need to point out that there were several different reports of the speech. They often gave different wording. I've given you the most inflammatory of the renditions of it. It's not exactly clear how obvious and how strong his call for assassination was. Most importantly, one of the things I found out for this new edition, Gosden wrote a short article that was never published on the failure of the strike. The article suggests why conservative leaders were quick to use his rhetoric against him. The context of the article is instructive of its writing. Sorry, picture of the Miners' Liberation League at one of their meetings in Vancouver. The context of the article is worth considering. Gosden wrote it in the Vancouver office of Cyrus V Cook, a name I'm guessing no one here is familiar with. Cook, though, was an associate and friend of the anarchist Emma Goldman. He was her advance agent in several speaking tours and accompanied Goldman in 1912 when she spoke in the aftermath of the San Diego free speech fight where Gosden was arrested. Cook was a member of different overlapping anarchist and bohemian circles. He published anarchist and utopian books and pamphlets. His daughter, Edvadna Cook, was a member of the anarchist community at home, Washington. And Cook corresponded with Lucy Parsons, a radical who had married Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket anarchists hanged in 1887. Parsons herself attended the founding convention of the IWW and spoke in Vancouver on at least one occasion. In his brief memoirs, Gosden says that he actually saw her speak at one point, and it's quite possible. Cook lived in Vancouver for a few years, working, this is a little weird, working as the sales representative for the Dr. Bell Electro Vigor machine. All right. This promised to restore health and youth to the wearer through the application of electricity. I'm sure if you zap your gonads with enough voltage, you get some kind of reaction. Yeah, unquestionably. Now, we laugh, but how many people here are wearing copper bracelets to ward off arthritis? How many of us have the world's most expensive urine from all the vitamin supplements we take? My point is that Cook was, I think, not just a crank, that part of his interest in, let's call it alternative medicine, also spoke to the fact that many anarchists and leftists were deeply skeptical, then and now, of accepted medical science, which, let's face it, has a long way to go. We know that most of the advances in science that have saved lives have been in things like better sewer systems rather than medical science. So some skepticism. No, I'm the first one. I tried it, didn't work. I'm just kidding. The last time I zapped myself, it was completely by accident. But my point is that Cook was not just a medical crank. He had radical connections and credentials, and in Vancouver served as the Miners' Liberation League Secretary-Treasurer. So Gosden's writing this article in Cook's office, I think is interesting. It tells us, again, the circles in which Gosden was traveling, that this was not just a question of convenience, but a question of context, that he wrote this letter here. The article itself was addressed to the wage workers of Canada, and it explained the dissolution of the Miners' Liberation League. Gosden recounted the work of the League, the pamphlets, the parades, the meetings and petitions, all to no avail. As he put it, the master's government still stood pat, and the railroading and persecution still went on. The League had then called for a general strike, for a 2-day holiday, as they put it, but the call, Gosden said, was ignored by the labor organizations in British Columbia and the United States. And according to Gosden, met with the open opposition of the major portions of the officials of the different bodies, especially those officials of the United Mine Workers of America. Workers actually put forward resolutions for a general strike on at least 4 different occasions. Not even an impassioned call for a strike, a general strike from the famed miners' agitator Mother Jones could budge the labor leaders. District 28 President Foster repeatedly insisted that a general strike could not work. He was supported, or perhaps instructed in this, by Frank Farrington, the UMWA strike director, appointed by the American president of the union. And Farrington himself was no radical. He set up his strike office in Seattle, and it's not clear that he actually ever went to Vancouver Island to view the strike that he was supposed to be directing. So my point is that the practical labor leaders were quick to distance themselves from any talk of a general strike. Gosden's speech, with its call for assassination, its hints at murder, gave them a way to dismiss the general strike as well by linking it to Gosden. The general strike is like assassination and sabotage, which no reasonable person wants. That was the logic of this, that they could insist that all 3 of these things were off the table. Well, with the UMWA leadership unwilling to adopt new tactics, with the BC labor movement disinclined to withdraw its labor in support, with the rank and file either unable or unwilling to act on its own, the Vancouver Island strike stalled. Miners slowly returned to the mines, and in August 1914, they voted overwhelmingly to return to work on terms they had rejected strongly only 2 months earlier. Both Farrington and Foster defended their action and their inaction in the aftermath of the strike's failure. Both insisted that the outcome had been inevitable. Farrington, in particular, blamed economic conditions, cheap coal from other countries, the intervention of the state, and Asian labor for the failure of the strike. In short, he blamed everything except any error or lapse of his own judgment or nerve. And of course, both Foster and Farrington reiterated that a general strike was A, impossible, and B, if possible, could not possibly succeed. And of course, the labor officials were absolutely right, and Gosden was wrong. A general strike had never occurred in Canada, could never occur in Canada, and would never occur in Canada until 1918, when BC workers, mainly in Vancouver, held a one-day general strike to protest the killing of Ginger Goodwin, a popular union organizer and socialist who had refused to be conscripted to fight in World War I. That made him a fugitive who took to the woods in Vancouver Island to avoid arrest. And there in July 1918, Goodwin was shot and killed by a special constable sent out to arrest him. Goodwin's death in 1918 inspired the first general strike in Canadian history. It was not the last. From 1918 to 1920, a wave of general strikes broke across Canada from Victoria to Amherst, Nova Scotia. Hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom did not belong even to unions, left their jobs to fight for better conditions and to support others who were on strike. That strike wave of 1919 was generated in part by the agitation and actions of a militant minority that included Robert Gosden, who were dismissed as cranks and radicals in 1914. Now, while the Winnipeg General Strike was defeated, they did not win the terms that the workers went out on strike for, the actions of 1919 led to the election of Labour candidates across Canada in municipal and provincial and federal elections throughout the 1920s. And many of the organizers of the 1930s and 1940s learned their craft from 1919 and from the people who had taken part in that upsurge of strike activity. Oddly enough, Robert Gosden was not part of that 1919 wave of general strikes, despite his calling for it a few years earlier. Whatever support he had had among working people earlier in his call for sabotage in the general strike and his criticisms of the labor leaders meant that he would be frozen out of the labor movement by 1919. Now, to be fair, Gosden seems to have relished his role as a sectarian. Didn't really agree with anybody. There's an old joke. I know it's old because I first put it in print about 20 years ago, and it was old when I heard it, but I'll tell it again. How many Marxists does it take to go fishing? The answer is 50. 1 to hold the pole, and 49 to find the correct line. All right? So there's a song from the 1940s that sums it up nicely. And while some of the characters may not be known to everyone here tonight, David York and Alan Seeger, I think, will get it. Others may not. But I think the message still comes through. The hint here is that the only place these people would ever exist in one place peacefully is in the words of this song. So let me just... The electro-vigor belt. It works. I'm sorry. This is a song called Bill Bailey, the Ultimate Sectarian. We all know a Bill Bailey. Some of us have been a Bill Bailey. Bill Bailey belonged to every radical party that ever came to be, till he finally decided to start his own party so he wouldn't disagree. He got himself an office with a sign outside the door, Marxist League in letters red. And to everyone who came around, these are the words he said. Oh, you may be a friend of Max Shackman, Jim Cannon, and you might agree. You might get along with Norman Thomas and with Algernon Lee. You may be an old-time wobbly and think J. Love Stone's fine. You may be a comrade to all of those folks, but you ain't no comrade of mine. For 17 years, Bill Bailey kept his office with the sun outside the door. But he never, ever got a new member. Everybody just made him sore. And then one night, there came a big fire, and through the flame and smoke, as the firemen rushed in to save Bill's life, oh, these are the words he spoke. Oh, you may be a friend of Ben Gitlow, Reverend Musty, and you might agree. You may get along with Emma Goldman and with the SLP. You may have belonged to every radical party that ever had a line. You may be a comrade to all of those folks, but you ain't no comrade of mine. And so on this day, Bill Bailey passed away, and his soul to red heaven flew. He was greeted at the gate by old Karl Marx and Freddie Engels too. They said, "Welcome, comrade," as they opened the gate to let Bill come inside. As he slammed the door back in old Bill's face, these are the words he cried. Oh, you may be a friend of Karl Kotsky and a pal of Ferd Lassalle. You may get along with William Liebknecht in the First International. You may have inspired every radical party from the Hudson to the Rhine. You may be a comrade to all of them folks, but you ain't no comrade of mine. So, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Bob was definitely a sectarian. He knew what side he was on, and there weren't that many people there with him. So this isolation was in part, I think, self-imposed. But it also reflected the fact that since his fiery speeches, of course, the First World War had broken out. And that put a huge pressure on the labor movement and socialists, caught between the demands of the state for patriotism and their own varying commitments to anti-militarism and to international solidarity. As one SFU student, Dale McCartney, has noted, it wasn't until 1917 that labor and the left recovered from the impact of the war and the patriotism associated with it, and started then to develop consistent and coherent tactics and strategies. Until then, the movements were more divided and split than ever. Their ability to maneuver, hemmed in by the demands of capital and the state to support the war, and the crackdown on radicals and the left, and the labeling of strikes as injurious to the war effort and even traitorous. So as a worker without a recognized trade, isolated from the labor movement, Gosden scrambled to find what jobs he could. Janitor, ditch digger, laborer. He moved to Alberta by 1918 with his friend and fellow wobbly Owen Paulson and Ethel Emery Cuthbertson, a poet and mystic who had immigrated to Canada from New Zealand, and who, with her daughter Helen, lived with Gosden and Paulson in what the newspapers at the time referred to as a menage, hinting there was something a little untraditional about their relationship. And by 1918, the four of them, including little Helen, had moved to Pincher Creek, Alberta, which I have brilliantly illustrated here. There it is. They continued to engage in radical activity, believe it or not, in Pincher Creek, Alberta. By then, Canadians were sick and tired of the war and the endless, pointless slaughter. Men stopped volunteering for military service, and the campaigns to get them to enlist were having less and less success, whether they used shame, as you see here, or bribery. Thus, the conservative government of Robert Borden, if you want a picture of him, you'll have to pull out a $100 bill. I don't have one. Borden's government brought in conscription, the draft. The draft was, of course, bitterly opposed in many parts of Canada, in Quebec, as we all know, but not just in Quebec. Labor had been opposed to conscription before the war started, in part because it believed it would be used by the local boards that would be staffed by upright members of the business community would be used to send radicals and activists off to war and get them out of the factory. Of the more than 400,000 men, including Ginger Goodwin, who registered for conscription, 95% of them applied to be exempted from military service, which tells you something about their interest in going off to fight in 1917. And of those called up, many, including Ginger Goodwin, decided to hide out instead in camps with others, supported by members of their families and their communities. We know very little about this part of Canadian history. Any grad students out there looking for a topic, this would be fabulous. But many of the records have been destroyed. When they actually arrested and caught some people, many of the records were destroyed. But we do know that there were camps of conscription avoiders in Vancouver Island, around Cumberland, where Ginger Goodwin was, in Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, and in Pincher Creek, Alberta, where Paulson and Gosden and Cuthbertson established a camp in an unused ranch, putting 24 beds in the house there and a shed, and even redirecting a small stream closer to the house so water would be easier to fetch. They did so in dangerous conditions. The mainstream press eagerly took part in war hysteria, even suggesting here in the Globe newspaper, becomes the Globe and Mail, suggesting that pacifists could be put in cages and taken to the front where they could be used as gas detectors. Kind of a canary in a coal mine scenario. The conscription resistors at Pincher Creek would soon have more cause for alarm when local newspapers reported the shooting of Ginger Goodwin in 1918. Killed as evader, read the headline. Another part, you can see it up here, labeled Goodwin the dead socialist labor draft evader. Gosden, of course, fit every part of those categories except the dead part. And with this article hinting that perhaps this death was justified, they had some cause for alarm. Well, that was the tone of the press when two men traveling in a car between Calgary and Pincher Creek were stopped and arrested by police. According to the Calgary Herald, the two were armed to the teeth and soon led the police to the camp at Pincher Creek, where 4 men, including Gosden, were arrested. The headlines were sensational, inflamed by labor unrest, of course, worry that there would be more general strikes after the death of Goodwin. And the headline here read, IWW suspects build fort at Pincher Creek, entrench house at Prentice Ranch, and store up ammunition. 11 days later, the papers, armed to the teeth, turned out to mean police had found 3 rifles and ammunition, which they returned to the 3 men they took them from. And they charged one with having a loaded pistol on his person, for which he received a month in jail. The 4th person, Robert Gosden, was discovered to be a defaulter, that is, someone who had failed to register for conscription. And Gosden was then turned over to the military authorities. And we see here his attestation record. Normally the form you would fill out when you volunteer, but would be filled out for you if you were arrested. And we find some neat stuff about Gosden here. Hair color, dark brown. Eyes, blue. Height, 5'7", and I can never quite make it out. A little tiny bit. Maybe on there big enough you can see it more clearly. Chest expansion, 3 inches. No doubt because of the electro-vigor belt. I found out nothing else about his arrest or the disposition of his case. As I mentioned earlier, many of those records were destroyed. But there may be another reason why there are no records for Gosden's case. For by January 1919, just 4 months after his arrest, Robert Raglan Gosden, that fiery radical, was now working as a paid informant for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, before Alan and others get up and say something, I know that in 1919 it was still the Northwest Mounted Police, but calling it the Royal Canadian Mounted Police just sounds a lot more dramatic. Right? So, But by 1918, the Northwest Mounted Police was responsible for policing the 4 western provinces, and by then already had a special division to infiltrate left and labor organizations. And Robert Raglan signed up to help, becoming, I believe, the only person to appear in 2 different sets of RCMP files of that time, in the subversive file and the informant file. Right? And for good or for evil, he applied himself with energy and even creativity. Using aliases and regrowing the mustache he'd shaved off earlier, Bob Gosden, also known as Bob Brown and Bob Smith, worked and agitated as a radical among miners at Hillcrest and McLeod in Alberta and in Fernie, BC, and reported back to his police handlers. His most significant work happened in March of 1919. As you know, because I told you, by then strikes were spreading across Canada, including several general strikes and sympathy strikes. And the strikes were increasingly accompanied by radical questions and demands. Workers took seriously wartime rhetoric about fighting for democracy and started asking why could they not have some in the factories where they worked. Conscription had revealed how government would force citizens to bend to its will. As workers sacrificed for the war effort, they saw their earnings eroded by inflation. Scandals around war profiteering made it clear that for working people, war meant slaughter, while for the rich, war meant opportunity. Each of these fueled that strike wave and pushed workers to consider that if this was the best the system could offer, perhaps a new system was needed. Thus, in March of 1919, about 250 delegates assembled in Calgary for the Western Labour Conference. Originally planned as a strategy session for the upcoming Trades and Labour Convention, it went beyond the modest plans of its organizers. Its first resolution called for the abolition of the present system of production for profit, and the substitution, therefore, of production for use. Really, the essence of socialism, you might argue, the production not for profit, but for use, production for need. Subsequent resolutions called for industrial unionism along the lines of the IWW and the creation of a new Canadian union, the One Big Union. Just before one key vote, David Rees, a delegate from the United Mine Workers of America, demanded and got the floor on a question of privilege. He stood up and warned that there are spies among us today. He pointed directly at Robert Gosden, who was sitting in the visitors' gallery, and denounced him as a police spy, a stool pigeon, and an agent provocateur. Gosden was unflappable. He asked for permission to defend himself, but the convention did not vote to let him speak, so he wrote a lengthy article published in the Fernie Ledger newspaper, reminding people that labor officials such as David Rees had let down the Vancouver Island strikers in 1914. That the same delegates now calling for industrial unionism had fought the IWW viciously earlier to protect their own craft unions and their own lucrative positions as labor leaders. Bob outlined his own history as a leader of the Miners' Liberation League who had exposed the cowardice of the UMWA, had organized workers in Prince Rupert, and had sheltered the family of a blacklisted miner. All true. And all, of course, irrelevant. Because Gosden was a spy for the police. He'd been given the code name of Agent 10. And he prepared a lengthy report on the Western Labour Conference, a report that went all the way to RCMP Commissioner A.B. Perry, and from there to the Prime Minister's office. The report gave an accurate and insightful account of the unrest among Canadian workers and the role of the Socialist Party at the Labour Conference. Gosden's last section even offered advice on how to control the labour unrest. He suggested, first, federal minimum wage laws and laws reducing the hours of work. We called for public works projects to be well funded by the government. He then pointed out, accurately enough, that many of the established unions, or more accurately, many of the leaders of those unions, would be opposed to the one big union because it threatened their livelihoods as paid officials. They, he said, could be counted on to work with the government to quash the radicals. If government and business strengthened the conservative union leaders, he argued, with publicity, with appointments to government positions, he said, all of the machinery of publicity and preferment and privilege, those conservative labor leaders would do their utmost to put down the workers' revolt. At the same time, this is this good-evil thing coming pretty obviously here. At the same time, Gosden wrote, the government should attack the left leaders of the Socialist Party and the one big union, who he labeled as intelligent opportunists. Their one weakness, he continued, was that they lack the physical courage of their convictions. The key to eliminating them as a threat, he wrote, was to play on their fear without turning them into martyrs. That, he said, could be accomplished by arresting them in such a way that they will automatically disappear from their friends and activities, picked up in secret and held in secret custody. That, he said, would create distrust and fear in the movement, and that would prevent the solidarity and enthusiasm so essential to its success. The report was passed up the line to the RCMP commissioner with comments appended by different readers, one of whom regretted that Gosden's kidnapping plan sadly was actually against all the principles of British law. Though he added, hopefully, perhaps we might be guided by wartime conditions. Another found the report somewhat overdrawn and drastic, but agreed that cooperating with the conservative union leaders was a very good idea. That reader also recommended that the government undertake a program of propaganda that would claim that if socialism came to be in Canada, it would, as it had in Bolshevik Russia, mean free love and the socialization of women, turning them from private property into public property. That, he said, will play very well with the women's organizations in Canada. They won't like that one bit. RCMP Commissioner Perry, who according to Wikipedia I just found out is a great-grandfather of our former Premier Gordon Campbell, but I don't think we can blame Commissioner Perry for that. Perry observed that harsh repression of radicals and strikers would actually antagonize the Conservatives. Better, the government should work with the Conservative union leaders along the lines Gosden had suggested. And that, in fact, became one of the strategies the government used to stop the labor unrest, accompanied as it was with the repression at Winnipeg and the deportation of thousands of activists. Well, what turned Bob Gosden from a fiery radical to a police informer? We, of course, can only speculate at the inducements and motives that led him to take up his new career. Money, love of intrigue, a way to strike back at the labor and left movements that had isolated him, chance to do more interesting work than laboring jobs, pressure, of course, perhaps, to avoid a jail term for evading conscription. We'll never know for certain, though will be happy to speculate with you afterwards over refreshments. There's a lot more to Gosden's story, but because I was late, and again, I'm very Canadian, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. You heard that, how do you get 50 Canadians out of the pool? Please leave the pool now. I'm sorry, we're running out of time and I'm making bad jokes, but I'm going to leave it up to you to judge Robert Gosden. Was he good? Was he evil? both? To be frank, I don't know how we assess a life, especially when we know only fragments of it. We have a few clues as to what Gosden himself may have thought. Until the end of his life, he kept a postcard of Joe Hill with him in his papers, the IWW songwriter who was executed by firing squad in the state of Utah in 1915. And Gosden warned that these Joe Hills are working and helping to complete what they died for. The ruling class is now absolutely insane and is committing social suicide, which is the karma they have earned. Bob had always liked the poems of Robert Service, and near the end of his life could still recite the men that don't fit in. Service was sometimes called the Kipling of Canada, and better known for poems such as The Shooting of Dan McGrew and The Cremation of Sam McGee. But like Kipling, Service also wrote about and for working people with deep respect, and sometimes with a political edge. Like Kipling, he used plain language and simple rhyming schemes so his poems could be easily committed to memory and carried around almost like an e-book. And so Gosden would often recite the men that don't fit in. There's a race of men that don't fit in, a race that can't stand still. So they break the hearts of kith and kin and they roam the world at will. They range the field and they rove the flood and they climb the mountain's crest. Theirs is the curse of the gypsy blood. They don't know how to rest. If they just went straight, they might go far. They are strong and brave and true. But they're always tired of the things that are and they want the strange and new. They say, could I find my proper groove, what a deep mark I would make. So they chop and change and each fresh move is only a fresh mistake. And each forgets as he strips and runs with a brilliant, fitful pace. It's the steady, quiet, plodding ones who win in the lifelong race. And each forgets that his youth is fled, forgets his prime is past. So he stands one day with a hope that's dead in the glare of the truth at last. He has failed. He has failed. He has missed his chance. He has just done things by half. Life's been a jolly good joke on him. Now is the time to laugh. He's one of the legion lost. He was never meant to win. He's a rolling stone and it's bred in the bone. He's a man who won't fit in. Well, that may be a rather optimistic assessment of Robert Gosden, but I confess I'm something of a rank sentimentalist. Does his story have any lessons? I think there are several, but I'm going to talk about only one tonight. A lesson from his early career, from before he became a radical. A time when Robert Gosden called for a general strike, when the cautious, practical, pragmatic union leaders ran out of ideas and watched the Vancouver Island strike collapse. The Robert Gosden who fought bosses and governments from Prince Rupert to San Diego. That Robert Gosden embodied a rebel spirit that gave energy and momentum to a movement in desperate need of both. But too often, and this is me stopping being a historian and now hectoring you, too often in Gosden's day and in ours, the rebels are silenced by the institutional leaders who then rob the movement of much of its energy and vigor. Maybe the electric vigor belt would help them. I don't know. But by silencing the critics such as Gosden, the critics who challenge them to develop new tactics and new tools, they teach others not to be critical of the leadership. By rejecting ideas out of hand, they seem to favor solutions that serve their own self-interest. And in doing so, they blunt one of labor's best weapons, the spirited shop floor militancy of the rank and file. And so today,